This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour. Welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And welcome to the second in my series on whisky. Are whisky producers trying to hide something by removing dates from the bottles? Well, you'll find out in this podcast. And if you're new to my podcasts, I try to share with you an experience, albeit virtually, of the real Scotland, and as well as telling you about its people, customs and traditions, and taking you on tours of the Highlands and Islands, there are also specialist subjects that I cover, and this series of 3 podcasts is on whisky. In the last podcast, I covered its history, bringing you up to date as to how whisky first came to Scotland, and the amazing industry it has turned into today. I also talked about the famous whisky drinking cup, the Quaich, and I was delighted to have a friend and Blue Badge guide colleague of mine, Ronnie Berry, to tell us about the industry in his capacity as one of the few privileged individuals who hold the title of Keeper of the Quaich. And if you have not heard that interview with Ronnie, then I do strongly recommend it. So please go to my website, www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, to listen to the podcast Whisky 1. Well, I remain in Helensburgh today recording this podcast, and I've had a couple of emails asking me where Helensburgh is. Well, it's about 25 miles northwest of Glasgow, and is on the River Clyde estuary. It's only about 5 miles west of Loch Lomond, and I've recently finished a video of Loch Lomond, so watch out for that on my website and also on YouTube. Whatever connection you may have to Scotland, or if you're intrigued by this small but beautiful land, then I hope that by listening to the podcasts and viewing my monthly video podcast, you get a feel for what this magical land of the Scots has to offer. What I'm going to cover today is the process of production. How is whisky made? I will also cover what it is that makes a Scotch whisky, which is now protected by law. I will also tell you how to interpret the label on the bottle of whisky, which, if you know what to look for, contains a huge amount of information. And why did some producers stop putting a year or date of the whisky on the bottle? Are they trying to hide something? I will be mentioning a few distilleries during this series, so if you have a particular tipple, please get in touch and let me know. I could include it in one of my future episodes, so just drop me an email at john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk or get in touch via the contact form on my website. And thank you to Mick Allen, as well as Macallan, who is enjoying my podcast and delighted to hear about your adventures on Islay. I'll be covering Islay in September, Mick, so watch out for that series. I'm very grateful for your suggestions on cycle touring, Neolithic monuments and wild camping too. They are now on the list of future topics. Well, I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy this, the second episode of my podcast on whisky. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram of the amber nectar, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slàinte. I said at the beginning of this series that it's quite incredible that a condensed liquid taken from a boiling fermented mash of grains could produce something so beautiful. So let me explain. The first time I toured a distillery, quite a few years ago now, I was gobsmacked to discover how relatively easy it was to make whisky. When I was told that there were only 3 ingredients, water, grain and yeast, and this never changed, it blew me away. I remember saying to the guide at the time that there must be more to it, and of course when one considers the whole process there is, but in the end there are always those 3 ingredients. So what do we do with them? I did say that I was going to concentrate on Scottish single malt whisky, so that is the process I'm going to refer to here. Firstly, a malted grain has to be produced, and the single malt distilleries will be using barley. Other grain can be used, but I'll come to that later when we talk about grain whisky and blended whisky. So barley is soaked in hot water, then removed from the vat and laid out on a large malting floor in the distillery. It is spread out evenly on the floor to a narrow depth. The barley is then continually turned to stop the tiny roots that will appear at the germination phase from getting tangled, causing the individual grains to stick together. Malting releases enzymes that break down the starches in the grain and help convert them to sugars. This malting of the barley by the maltman was strenuous work, using special shovels to continually turn the grains. They started at one end and continued to the other of the malting floor, and when they reached the other side, they started again. The maltman had to closely monitor the barley to ensure the germination process was proceeding, as well as ensuring that the tiny roots did not become entangled before the malted barley was sent to be dried. A consequence of this turning the barley was an ailment in the maltman called monkey shoulder. Actually, you may have seen a whisky called monkey shoulder. It's a blended whisky produced in the Speyside region of Scotland by William Grant. Well, the monkey shoulder ailment was sometimes picked up by these men working long shifts and continually turning the barley. It tended to cause their arm to hang down. It was a bit like a monkey's, so they nicknamed it monkey shoulder. Anyway, once the grains have germinated, the malted barley is transferred to a kiln and dried using hot air, normally placed on a metal grill above a furnace. And this is the point where the future whisky will gain its smoky or non-smoky state. If the furnace uses coal or coke, the barley will remain untainted. If the furnace burns peat, then the grains are imbued with a smoke, and that gives the future whisky flavour its smoky, earthy or peaty aroma and taste. As you can see, this whole process is very labour intensive and takes some time to get right. The malting process today is mechanised, and malted barley is produced in the main by specialised maltsters. If you have visited the island of Islay, for example, you will have seen one at Port Ellen. The old Port Ellen distillery was turned into a maltster, and if you look inside, you can see a huge drum that rotates with the wet barley inside, removing the need for men to do it manually. There are still a few distilleries that have retained a maltings facility, such as Highland Park in the Orkneys, Kilcoman, Bowmore and Laphroaig from Islay, and Glenfiddich on Speyside. Also Springbank in Campbelltown and Glenord on the Black Isle. But in reality, they only malt a small proportion of their barley, effectively to keep the skill alive, but they buy in most of their malted barley from professional producers. When I was first told of this process, I was a bit concerned because I thought that every distillery would be making their own type of barley, and especially if they were smoky, peaty malts, then they would have to have the malt at a particular part per million of smoke. Well, I'm assured by the maltsters that this can be achieved. So what the distillery does is it requests or demands a particular type of barley to be dried in a particular way and with so many parts per million of smoky texture. So I'm sort of reassured by that explanation. Up to you whether you are reassured as well. So once the barley is dried and the germination process has been halted, it has to be ground into a coarse flour, or grist as it's called. The barley is fed into the machine, ground and sucked out the other side into a large vat. And during the grinding process, there are very fine particulates of dust in the air, so this is one place you're not allowed to use a camera in the distillery, just in case a spark was to set off an explosion. So, the coarse flour is now in a vat, called a mash tun, and this is mixed with hot water for a variable amount of time. Now, if ever you come on a tour with me to Speyside, I'll take you for lunch in Aberlour. Well, there's a great distillery for a start, but there's also a great bar and restaurant called the Mash Tun. It has a barrel-shaped frontage, and the floorboards are actually made from the oak beams of an old mash tun. They have an amazing whisky collection, and the food is superb, so not to be missed if you're passing that way. Well, back to the distillery's mash tun. With the grist now mixed with hot water, this process is referred to as mashing. The mix is known, not surprisingly, as the mash. Now, during the mashing, enzymes that were developed during the malting process convert the barley starch into sugar, producing a sort of barley sugar liquid known as wort. I've tasted it, and it reminds me of the barley water drink we used to get as kids. And once you have this barley sugar liquid, or wort, it's then transferred to another large vessel called a washback, where it's cooled. Now, in the larger distilleries, you'll have to climb stairs to get to the top of these normally huge wooden barrel-looking casks onto a platform to be able to see inside the vats, and this is where the first part of the magic happens. Traditionally, washbacks were made of European larchwood, Douglas fir or American Oregon pine, due to the wood having a tight grain and also being known to be free from knots and available in long planks. Well, today new washbacks are made of stainless steel, and as you can imagine, there's much debate over the advantages of both types of washback in the whisky industry. Now, once the wort's transferred to these massive vats or washback, it is cooled and then the yeast is added and the wort is allowed to ferment. And to watch it, it's amazing because the yeast is effectively eating all the sugar, and it's as if there's a feeding frenzy going on. And if you look at the vat, the wort's churning, it's almost as if a fight was taking place inside the liquid within the washback. During the process, carbon dioxide is generated by the fermentation and produces a considerable amount of foam. Now, most distilleries have spinning switcher blades, effectively a large fan spinning around the top of the washback, which disturbs the foam and stops it from building up too much. On a typical visit, you'll be invited to stick your head into the washback to smell the produce, and you get a real kick as you breathe in the carbon dioxide. It really clears the head. So, what's actually happening is that the yeast is converting the sugary wort into crude alcohol and produces a liquid similar in aroma and taste to sour beer. It takes about 48 to 60 hours, and the crude beer produced is about 5 to 8% alcohol by volume. This liquid is called the wash. The final step in producing the raw whisky spirit is the distillation phase, and that is what finally produces the water of life. Anyway, we take this wash and transfer it into a large bulbous copper container called a still, or for its correct name, the wash still. Not difficult, is it? So, like a kettle, the liquid is heated up to boiling point, the alcohol evaporates and travels to the top of the still, through the line arm, and angled at about 90 degrees. I say about because some are slightly higher or lower, and that does affect the whisky produced. Anyway, the steam travels all the way up the still, up the line arm, and into a condenser, where it's cooled and turns back into a clear liquid. At this first distillation phase, the liquid now has an alcohol content of about 20% and is called a low wine. This low wine is distilled a second time in another still called a spirit still, and this time the liquid that runs off comes out at about 60 to 70% alcohol content. It is split into 3 cuts. The first 15% or so is called the foreshot, and that contains oily and poisonous higher alcohols at the start, and is placed into a holding tank. The second cut or middle cut is the one used to make this batch of whisky, and the third cut, called feints or aftershots, and it contains the lower alcohols at the end of the distilling process, is too weak and is mixed with the first cut to be used for the next distillation, and that just shows that nothing is wasted. So we now have the whisky spirit. It is a clear liquid and is in the last stage of its journey to becoming a fabulous malt whisky, the final part of the magic. What happens next is this newly made spirit is placed into oak casks for the maturation process. Now, normally bourbon casks, but it can be placed in other types of casks. It has to be oak, however, to be called Scotch. The spirit will remain in these barrels for a minimum of 3 years, and anything up to 30 years plus to mature. Sometimes the matured spirit is finished off in another barrel, and that will have had sherry, port Madeira and other wines to give it a distinctive flavour of sweetness. Now, the oak casks are stored in a bonded warehouse, and if you've ever visited one, they are normally cold and dark, just the way the maturing whisky likes it, with the temperature remaining fairly constant. The casks actually breathe, and, through evaporation, each cask loses about 0.5 to 2% of spirits every year. This is known as the angel share, and, as I'm sure you can calculate yourself, on a 12-year-old malt the barrel can lose up to 24% of the volume. There is a great film by Ken Loach called The Angel Share, and not to be missed. As it happens, my guest in my next week's podcast, Charles MacLean, Scotland's top whisky guru, starred in that film. So tune in next week to Whisky episode number 3 to hear all about it. And Charles tells a great story. So there the barrel sits for many years. It has to stay at least 3 years in an oak barrel in Scotland to officially be called Scotch. And at the end of the maturation period, it emerges as amber nectar. It will take on the colour of the barrel in which it was stored, and the previous contents, whether it's bourbon, sherry, port, or other fortified wines. Indeed, colour of the whisky can often be a clue as to the type of cask it was stored in. For example, sherried whisky is usually darker or more amber in colour, while whisky aged in bourbon casks is usually a golden yellow or honey colour. Of course, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'll be focusing on single malt whisky, but I have to mention grain whiskies as well. There are 2 types of stills used in distillation. That's the pot still I've just mentioned for the single malts, and secondly the coffee still for grain whisky, which is distilled in a column, which gives a continuous method of distillation using grains other than barley. And whereas the single malt is made from a single batch of barley, and the quantity of whisky produced is limited by the amount of that pot still can make at any one time, the coffee still is continuous and can make huge quantities of whisky. In Scotland, most Scotch malt whisky distilleries distill their product twice. In Ireland, for example, they distill it 3 times. But in Scotland there are exceptions to this rule, and a few distilleries triple distill, and they include Auchentoshan Distillery just outside Glasgow and Springbank's Hazelburn up at Campbelltown. Springbank add another twist to their Springbank brand because they sometimes distill it 2.5 times. And talking about Springbank Distillery reminds me of a story of a number of years ago. One of my clients and I were travelling down to Kennacraig to meet the ferry, and we were going off to Islay. Now, if you go from Glasgow to Kennacraig, you've got to pass through Campbelltown, and I suggested that we stop there for at least a quick tasting. My guest's reply was, "No, I've tasted Springbank and it was shit." Excuse the language, but that's exactly what he said. Anyway, we had enough time to stop in just to visit the shop, and while we were there we met the warehouseman, who said he could give us a separate tour because there was very little trade that day. They went off, and as they were leaving, my client said to me, "John, come and get us in about 15 minutes. Find an excuse to get us out of there because I don't see myself hanging around here too much longer." So 15 minutes later I went back, and they were sitting in the warehouse itself. And as I walked in, my client said to me, "John, can you give us just another 15 minutes? I said, "No problem at all." So I went back 15 minutes later, and when I went back, the client said to me, "When do we actually have to leave Campbelltown to get to Kennacraig to meet the ferry?" And I said, "Well, we need to leave within about 45 minutes to an hour." He said, "Right, we'll give it an hour and come back and get us." Of course, an hour later I went back to find my clients, who at this stage were joking and having a fantastic time with the warehouseman. Now, when we left Campbelltown, I said to my client, "Why did you stay so long?" And he said, "That was some of the best whisky I've ever tasted." So there you go, first impressions don't always count, and well done Springbank for converting a non-believer. So there we have it. In simple terms, you take 3 ingredients: water, barley, yeast. Take the barley, wet it until it germinates, dry it over a furnace fire, and use peat if you want it smoky. Once it's dried, crush the barley into a coarse flour, mix that flour with hot water and squeeze out all the sugar, leaving a sugar barley liquid. Add yeast and watch the transformation to a low alcohol beer. Take that liquid and put it into a huge copper kettle and boil it. The steam, when condensed, gives you the whisky spirit. Put the spirit into an oak barrel, normally ex-bourbon, and wait minimum 3 years. Open barrel and enjoy the amber nectar. Absolutely lovely. I'm often asked about the alcohol by volume content. Well, UK regulations allow distillation to a purity level of 94.8 ABV, compared with 80% for American whiskies. In reality, Scottish whiskies are normally only distilled to about 64%, and the normal percentage of a bottle of malt is 40%. Higher percentages are gained by buying directly from the distillery, where cask strength can be gained. As it happens, all this is covered in UK regulations governing the whisky industry. And as of 2009, the Scotch whisky regulations define and regulate the production, labelling, packaging, as well as the advertising of Scotch whisky in the United Kingdom. So, to be a Scotch whisky, the whisky must be produced at a distillery in Scotland from water and malted barley. and all of which must be processed at that distillery into a mash, converted to a fermentable liquid, then fermented at that distillery only by adding yeast, then distilled at an alcoholic strength by volume of less than 94.8% or 190 proof in the USA. The definition states that the whisky must be wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 litres, and retains the colour, aroma and taste of the raw materials used in its production and maturation. It can contain no added substances other than water and plain caramel colouring. Also, it must comprise a minimum alcoholic strength by volume of 40% proof. Whoa, hang on a minute. Did I hear you say caramel colouring in a pure Scotch malt whisky? Well, yes, I did mention it, but those are the rules. So are you now feeling a bit cheated that an additive may give the impression of age, i.e. darker colour, or could it change the flavour? Well, I'm sort of reassured by experts that it's only done to give consistency to colouring, which helps in the sales, and it doesn't affect taste whatsoever. But if you tune into next week's podcast, Whisky 3, you'll hear from Charlie McLean, one of Scotland's top whisky experts, and what he believes the addition of caramel actually does. I'd now like to turn to labelling. Now, this is important because for a whisky to be called Scotch, it must also be bottled and labelled in Scotland. Well, if you take time to have a read of the label before buying that favourite bottle of whisky, you might be surprised just how much information is contained on it. Clearly the name of the whisky will appear, and that name represents the distillery from which the spirit comes. It may also mention one of the 5 whisky regions of Scotland, and I'll be talking a bit more about in my next podcast, Whisky 3. The next thing most people look for is the age, where it was bottled, and which company owns the whisky. The label will always show whether it's a malt or a grain whisky, and as I mentioned earlier, a single malt is one that is produced entirely from malted barley and from one distillery. You may see the words single cask on the label, which signifies that the bottle comes from one cask, and these are known to have a higher alcohol content, as they're often bottled at cask strength. In simple terms, alcoholic strength is expressed on the label as alcohol by volume, or ABV, or sometimes simply vol. Now, whisky in Scotland is normally bottled between 40 to 46 ABV. Of course, whisky is considerably stronger when first extracted from the cask, so to get it to the desired bottle strength, water is added to dilute the whisky to the appropriate ABV. If the whisky is not diluted before bottling, then you will see cask strength on it. So let's have a look at the different terms used on the label to signify what type of whisky is inside. First of all, single malt. Well, that signifies the spirit inside is a malted barley whisky that comes from one distillery. About 10% of malts destined for bottling is single malt, and the rest normally goes to blending. Okay, the next is blended malt, and that signifies that this single malt whisky is a mixture of single malts from different distilleries. The word malt in the title is important. I mean, don't confuse this term with blended Scotch whisky, which does contain a proportion of grain whisky. Next term is blended whisky, and that signifies there's both malted whisky and grain whisky mixed into the bottle. And then finally grain whisky, and that's made of a number of different grains, normally corn or wheat or rye. And malt whisky is used in blends from any age over 3 years, but typically would be between 5 and 10 years old, as malt matures more slowly than grain. Another rather contentious statement on the label is the declaration of the filtration or final maturation process. Now, this process is used to remove compounds in the mature whisky that may make the whisky hazy when in the bottle, or when it's chilled, or when water or ice is added. A Scotch whisky that is noted as natural or non-chill filtered has not been through a filtration process during the bottling, and many consumers prefer this, knowing that they're drinking the raw material that emerged from the barrel. They don't want any unnatural process, as they see it, to interfere with their finely matured Scotch. Now, whisky is aged in various types of casks, and often in used sherry or port casks, and during the distinct portions of the maturation process, and will take on characteristics, flavour and aromas from such casks. Special casks are sometimes used at the end of the maturation process, and such whiskies may be labelled as wood-finished, sherry, port-finished, and so on. Now, I'd like to turn to a very important piece of information on the label, and I've left it until last deliberately, and that is the age of the whisky, or the age of the bottling, and that's normally the point at which maturation of the whisky is complete. Now, you know that to be called Scotch, the whisky must have matured in an oak cask for a minimum of 3 years. So if the whisky is taken from the barrel at that stage, it's a 3-year-old whisky, and that same principle applies to older whiskies. Date of the end of maturation is the date of the whisky. What I'm saying is that the age is determined by the amount of time it's been maturing in an oak cask, noting that when it's transferred to a bottle, it will remain in its matured state and no longer mature. Sorry, I seem to be hammering home that point, but if there is one subject that raises more controversy with my guests, it's one of the age of the whisky. One of the reasons for this is that there has been a recent increase in the production of single malts that do not declare an age on the bottle. And this is important because there's still a large number of whisky drinkers for whom an age statement remains one of the key factors influencing their decision to purchase a particular bottle. Well, I remember Chivas Regal's advertisement of many years ago where they were advising drinkers to look out for the number, know your age, know your whisky. Well, there have been many surveys conducted since, and Chivas Regal conducted an Age Matters campaign that followed a survey of 2,000 whisky drinkers in 9 countries, from Brazil to China. Apparently over 90% of respondents agreed that age is an important indicator of quality. And today I find on whisky tours that I do, many of my guests are perturbed that many distilleries are selling no age statement, or NAS, that just seems to go against the grain, if you'll excuse the pun. I think we've all sort of grown up with the mantra that just like fine wine, the more time that whisky has to age, the better it tastes. Well, before trying to resolve the aged versus the no-aged statement conundrum, we should perhaps look at why the whisky industry is in this predicament. Part of the problem is the popularity in whisky itself. Indeed, it would appear that the whisky industry has been so successful in pushing their product, there has been a massive surge in whisky's popularity, which has in turn seen a once plentiful supply of aged whisky reduced considerably. And in these days of supply and demand, the less of an item or product, the more of a price, and to make an aged single malt out of the price range of whisky drinkers is not a good marketing strategy. I might just mention one very well-known whisky that's been slowly erasing the digits from its labels. There are others, of course, such as Jura and Talisker, but the one that I want to mention is Macallan. It has an 1824 series based on colour: gold, amber, sienna and ruby, and my investigations reveal that the whiskies mixed in this single malt range from 10 to 17 years. So although officially the whisky will be called a 10-year-old, albeit not declared on the label, remember, you will be drinking some spirit aged 17 years old. So the argument for introducing this new way of selling no age statement whisky appears to allow greater flexibility and complexity in the mixing process. Well, so the advocates of such a process would argue. They state that as distillers are no longer constrained by age, they now have the freedom to introduce new flavours, not just through the oak barrels used and the distillation process, but also through the introduction of different aged whiskies, from the same distillery of course, that can introduce a complexity of flavour that you cannot get from a single aged whisky. I can hear the single aged connoisseurs wailing in the background that this juggling with the pure single aged single malt detracts completely from the very essence of Scotch whisky, and that moving away from this purity is like dancing with the devil. Well, you can see that it's not plain sailing, and the jury is out. But like all good things in life, it's all down to individual taste. For myself, I do have a slight difficulty with the no-age statement. For example, I can't see myself taking 2 or 3 bottles of exquisite but differently aged wine and mixing them to give more complexity of taste. It just doesn't feel right. Well, in the end, it's the whisky connoisseurs who will have the last word on this new method of production. And you have to ask, will they swallow it? However, all of that is just my personal opinion, and I will continue with my tipple of aged Highland Park, and as it happens, I have a wee dram sitting next to me. It's a 12-year-old Viking Pride, so I'll just have a wee sip, and as I do, I can say that it's probably a good note on which to end this episode 2 on whisky. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this second episode of my whisky series and hearing about the process of whisky making and some of the secrets that the industry tend to keep to themselves. In next week's episode 3 of my whisky series, I'm delighted to be talking to one of Scotland's foremost experts on whisky and a master of the quake, Charles MacLean. He's now on his 18th book on the industry, and what he doesn't know about whisky is probably not worth knowing. It will be a light-hearted jaunt around the world of whisky, and you'll enjoy some of Charlie's stories. Why don't you subscribe to my podcast on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or you can listen to my podcasts on the usual platforms such as Spotify, Apple, Google or TuneIn, and they're registered under my unique Scotland brand. If you've got any comments or questions about this or any of my podcasts, please do drop me a line at john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk or drop me a line via the contact form on my website. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you with me on this second part of our whisky journey. Join me next week to hear from a legend in the whisky world, Charles MacLean, master of the quake and a member of the Whisky Hall of Fame. If you're relaxing with a wee dram yourself at this moment, then to you, wherever you are, I raise my glass and wish you Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.